Welcome back, everyone. I'm sure you've had a wonderful lunch and a wonderful opportunity to live out the whole sense of making more connections as fast and in as meaningful a way as possible during the lunch break, and maybe caught a little glimpse of the sunshine outside too. We are really delighted now to gather for the keynote moment of this year's Fellows Festival. A powerful reflection on what it would mean to put social connection right at the heart of UK public life and right at the top of the government's policy-making agenda. Our keynote speaker is someone who's spent decades championing social connection and working with and for local communities. Former Labour MP and Minister for Social Exclusion in the Blair government, Baroness Hilary Armstrong is a life peer who serves as chair of the Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods, and in January this year was appointed by the current government as the founding chair of its Digital Inclusion Action Committee. We are all dying to hear what she has to say. Please welcome Baroness Hilary Armstrong.
Thanks a lot, Julia. I come to this from a long history. You can see I'm getting on. I'm not supposed to do that with a microphone. I'm getting on a bit. I've been working at this for a long, long time. And I'm going to give you some of the reflections from that, but also some of the work that I'm now engaged in. I hope you can hear I don't come from London. I'm married to somebody who does, so I sort of know a bit about London. But I come from the northeast of England. And I come from a place which, when I was born, was still was the largest shipbuilding town in the world. And along its coast had lots of coal mines. So that described what the place was like. Men in very difficult shift working, women mainly looking after them to make sure they were fit to get to work. I had one grandfather who was a boilermaker, or boilermaker as he would say, in the shipyards. They were the elite of the yards. I had another who was a grandfather, who was a miner. And he was a checkwayman in the mines, and he died just before I was born of the dust. He was encased in plaster to try to stop him coughing. But he left a huge legacy because he was a county councillor, he was a district councillor, he was secretary of the Miners' Lodge, and he'd established the Methodist chapel in the village. So that was what my heritage was. Men who had been working in hard labour, women who'd been supporting them. Both my mum and dad became school teachers because that was seen as the way forward for that generation. But it meant that we had connections in so many worlds. In the labour movement, my dad was a local councillor. As I say, his father had been a councillor too. My mum was very involved in local activities in Sunderland, but also was a school teacher in one of the more difficult areas of Sunderland. And my dad ran the chapel, really, in Sunderland. He was what they call the senior circuit steward. So he was the layperson who organised the whole area. And we all ended up going to different chapels, my brother and I to where our friends went to, and my mum and dad to start a new one. Everybody in the town thought that what my dad was doing was just checking whether they were paying their the right amount and they were getting things there. But it wasn't. It was when the local chapel closed because of a road development, it was us going somewhere else. So those connections came, even though for some people living in the area, there was a very limited connectivity. But my goodness, did my mum and dad understand the importance of connectivity. My mum had gone to college in Sunderland at the Teacher Training College. She made sure that neither my brother and I went to college closer than 100 miles away, because she wanted us to find out about other communities, about other places, and about other sorts of people, because we had, to put it mildly, I'd met very few black people in Sunderland. The occasional one that my dad would have coming to visit, because he was the person in the northeast that set up the United Nations Association after his experiences in the war. So I'm the most lucky person about the level of connectivity in my life, but I also grew up among a lot of people who really didn't want to know. And one of my jobs, early jobs, was a community and youth worker in a place in Sunderland called Southwick, which had been absolutely dominated by the shipyards. And when the yards closed, the community collapsed. And I went as the youth and community worker there, and it was, what, a mile and a half from the sea and the beach? I worked with kids who'd never been. And, you know, their level of belief that they could do anything was at the bottom. I went to open a Sure Start Centre in the estate that my dad had been councillor on. And I talked to the mums who were there and said, okay, tell me, what do you want your children to do? And they, you know, fairly low ambition. I said, which of them do you want to go to university? And they said, oh, that's not for us, Hilary. That's not for us and our family. And again, their level of ambition, their kids were only 18 months and 2 years by then, their level of ambition for their kids was already way down there. You and I find out from bits of social media what's going on in jobs. I just discovered LinkedIn. And I'm fascinated by it. I'm not looking for a job, by the way. But you know, that people find ways, but they're finding knowledge and information about jobs, about skills, about courses to improve their things from people who are doing it. Now, if you live on some of the estates that I'm looking at, you live somewhere where 50% of people are unemployed. Where if they're employed, they're likely to be working in 0-hour contracts so that their long-term condition of health means that they don't work all the time. Their belief that they can do much more is very, very limited. They will live, we went to visit one place where 20 years ago there'd been a pit and a power station. The last bus of the day now is 5 o'clock. So nobody on the estate can work because they can't get back home. And they can't afford a car because where they live is treated by the, you know, their postcode is treated as a difficult place by the insurance companies, so the insurance is higher both in their house and their car. So the world is stacked against them. And those of you who live in London would never understand what I can talk to you about in terms of transport. I was told recently, and I'm getting the DWP to do something about it, about a young man who had left care and was looked after by a caring organisation who placed him in a property in a village which is about 8 miles and 3 buses from the job centre. So he missed his appointment and was sanctioned. Told he should have walked there. Now in London that is incomprehensible. Nobody ever has to face anything like that. So when people this morning have been saying to you that social connections and knowing people, I mean, you know, your son, daughter, cousin whatever, would have been able to find somebody in the family who'd give them a lift, let alone needing to go on the car. But this is somebody who has no family, has nobody he can call on. If we want growth in this country, if we want to be a dynamic country, we've got to tackle issues like this. We've got to make sure that we do what we can to enable people who live without that aspiration, who live in areas where they don't get the opportunities that I now think are there for everybody and should be for everybody. We have a responsibility to do something for them. And that's what my commission on neighbourhoods is about. But also, I have to say, the digital inclusion work is all about. And I'll say a little bit about that, because I heard this morning, and I know, and I worried about this earlier in the week, how on earth do I link digital inclusion to connectivity? Because mainly people use it in an isolating way, but actually, I've got some stories to tell you about that too. We all have a responsibility to actually ensure that wherever people are born, whatever their parents do, we find ways to get opportunities for them. And not just we as individuals, but we in the institutions we are engaged in. I've promised Andy Haldane I'll mention Sunderland football. And I mention it to you in this way. I've always been a football supporter, you know, growing up in my family, and with my dad, I couldn't be anything else. However, when the last shipyard closed and the pit, the Sunderland Stadium is built on the last pit to close in Sunderland. The pitch is actually built at the top of where the pit head was. When it closed, the guy who was the chairman, who I knew well because he'd been a constituent of mine working in the steelworks in Concert, and then he'd gone and made some money. Bob Murray knew that this would have a devastating effect on the fan base. So what was the football club's responsibility for actually making sure that everything didn't fall apart for the fans? He got in touch with Hope Not Hate and got them to do a study of what this would mean and what the football club could do. They knew and they found that some of the problem was the working men's clubs were closing because the men didn't have the money to spend on the beer. Some would say that was a good thing, but never mind. But they also found that the reading age was very low. I mean, the truth was, when you knew there was a job, either in the pit or the yards, you didn't need to actually work very hard at school because you learnt on the job through an apprenticeship. So the reading ages were quite low, so they instructed everybody writing for the magazine that they had to write in words of one syllable and not be posh, so that everything was available to the fans. And they also, when they built the new stadium, they built classrooms into it. And then Bob established the foundation. And in the foundation, they now have a free school, which works with and takes on kids who are either excluded or about to be excluded from school. So they are working in a very different way, and it was all inspired by recognising the responsibility that important institution the football club had to the rest of the city. And if you saw the mad match on Tuesday night, where they scored in the very last minute of extra time, in the last second of extra time, and then there was mayhem, you will see how much the football means to the fan base. So what I'm saying to you is, we all have a responsibility. My commission is working and looking at, we've identified 613 neighbourhoods across the country that we're calling mission critical. That is that the government's missions need to be implemented there more than anywhere else. And if they are, they'll learn how to do it elsewhere too. We also know that it cannot be left to the state, either the national state or the local state or the new devolved authorities, that it has to be bottom up. There are people in every community that have got amazing qualities. I've mainly worked with women who've got complex needs because of abuse and violence in recent years. And I come across the most amazing women who most folk write off. In every community, there are people who can make a difference. And we have seen some amazing things as we've been going round. I was telling Julie before, we have looked at a place she knows well in Leicester, where 25 years ago they got the New Deal for communities, and you know, there was a fairly good slug of money came from government for that, but they were able to use some of it and get it matched funded to build a health centre, which they now own. And they built that health centre because there was no health provision on the estate, but it also meant that they now get the rental income from the users of that health centre. And they use that rental income to run groups locally, to run the youth activities, to do various other things. And they've also taken over an old boxing club, I think it is, and are doing other activities in there. So they have built a sustainable community pattern in order to tackle the disadvantage and particularly work on people's health. I was also saying we went to an estate in Gloucester where there is no health provision. It's a mainly council housing estate, and no health provision at all. And the Gloucester organisation approached the government in 2006 and the Transport Minister about a motorway running through, I think it's the M3. And it had gone through some farmers' fields, and he had a field that he couldn't use anymore because the motorway was down the middle of it. And he was prepared to sell that field. The service station was the obvious option. And so the minister worked with the Highways Association to enable this group to take over the service station. And they tell me it is now the best service station in the country, and it is fantastic. It is beautiful. 1% of everything that is taken goes back into that estate to work on issues that they need working on. So they've now got a pharmacy on the estate. They are just completing a small health centre, which a small activities centre, physical leisure centre, which is health-based, so that people can do activities over the week that are health-related. And that is because they've got sustainable assets that they can build on. So there's lots to do, and we all have a responsibility to be part of it. We know that loneliness is a real problem. You've had the figures. The US Surgeon General said lately that it's as deadly as smoking for reducing your life expectancy. You know, children, we are still trying to work out what happened during COVID in terms of their connectivity. But when I was doing the social exclusion work before, in 2006-07, I came across a programme of parenting that they used in Wales and that they persuaded every Sure Start in Wales to use. And that meant they were doing better in their outcomes than the English Sure Starts. So I got quite interested in this. And one of the things about this parenting programme is that it also operates in schools. And there was a good IPPR study at the same time which showed that children from longitudinal studies that were 10 years apart. One of them, they regularly sat down for a meal with their family. The next generation, 10 years later, they didn't, because they were on their computers or whatever. And they didn't know how to communicate with other people and with adults. And what this program that we got introduced as one of our evidence-based programs was that when it got to school age, they had big life-size puppets, and the children would sit in a group with a puppet, and they loved talking to the puppet. And then the teacher would have been trained how to actually move that to looking at the person when you're talking and getting that connection. So this is pre-COVID as well as, and it means that after COVID, we've got to look at these things even more carefully. I've got lots of stories. I decided to talk with you today in stories rather than giving you the facts and figures, because you probably know the facts and figures, and you certainly had some of them this morning. But the reality is, both in the neighbourhoods work, we see how important this is, but also the digital inclusion. I went to Newham on Thursday morning. I was in Wigan yesterday, I was in Newham on Thursday morning, and they brought together people from around the country as well as getting me to talk to people locally. And there were over 20 people in a class just learning the very basics about switching a computer on, about how to get into emails, how to get an email address, very basic stuff. And the stories that came from the people around the table were so moving. Many of them were migrants who didn't have good English, and this was one of the ways they were practicing their English. But also coming there, they were able to meet other people, and all of them said that was the most important thing about the Digital Inclusion Hub, that they could come together and meet other people. And they were learning things then that enabled them to get engaged with public services. So one mother talked about, because she got, as part of the program, a device, I think an old laptop, and she got Wi-Fi access. And she said, I can now help my children with their homework, because before we couldn't get the homework that was sent. And I certainly couldn't help them out with it. And I can talk to the teachers by email now. And I can do the same with the doctor. I can communicate with the health service through the app and through the computer. Another talked in really moving terms about she'd been isolated in her home, her husband had died, she had no, he'd not left any money, so nobody wanted to know her, she said, because she had no money. And she said, Monday and Thursday when I come here are the most important times in my life. But she too was getting access, and she told me about a friend who lived nearby who she'd taken her device to, her iPad, I think it was certainly a tablet of some sort. And this woman had a daughter in Australia that she'd not seen for 25 years, and grandchildren that she'd never seen. She talked to them on the telephone, and this woman got her connected with her daughter in Australia after 25 years, and she said, with tears running down her, that was the first time she'd seen her children's mouths move in 25 years. So, digital exclusion, I'm a bit anxious about the internet isolating people, but I've also found out it can bring people together. And we've got to use these things for the best and not let the people who want to use them for the worst take over. So we have a huge job to do. I am convinced that we can begin to really make a difference. We can begin to see neighbourhoods, towns, areas that have been left behind. I could say a lot about that. But we have to start with the people. And we have to give them a say in what needs to be built, in what it needs to be doing. And if we, the state, think we know the answers, we'll end up with it not working again. So we have to work with people where they are, whatever is happening to them, and we have to make sure that we give them the means, the teaching, the learning, so that they can take hold of it and change the opportunities in their community. And let me tell you, that will make a difference to all of us, because it will mean our country can prosper and we can live together more happily. Thank you. I've talked too long.
You did not talk too long, Hilary, let me assure you. And I nicked your seat whilst you were doing it, so forgive me for that. I'm really keen that we get some questions for Baroness Armstrong, so I don't know where the microphone, they're already up and running. But I suppose there's so much that leapt out to me about that really, very moving speech, Hilary, because you based it in stories, in those stories that you've been listening on your, I mean, frankly, extraordinary travels from Newham to Wigan and back down to talk to us today, building it so beautifully around personal stories. But when you talked about, there were some lessons I learnt in government about how Sure Start was being adapted in Wales that I could see were working, and I got translated into a space and it started having an impact because I joined the dots. Who at cabinet level is caring and joining the dots?
Oh, there are some of them. I am never, you know, the big thing is, anyway, in politics, you always have to have hope. And I think some of the people coming into government had forgotten that. You've got to give folk hope. And there are some very clear people. Pete in DSIT joins the dots all the time, but then he worked with me as my SPAD. He learned at my knee when I was doing social exclusion, which is why I'm doing the digital inclusion job, because he learned that that's what you have to do. I actually do think getting rid of Sure Start was one of the most stupid decisions that was ever made in this country. And that's the other thing I should have said. These stories about groups finding ways of making money is because you've got to have programs that are sustainable and long-term. You cannot do this in 4 to 5 years. But you've got to lay the groundwork. You've got to get the stuff in to actually make sure that over the years it can be sustained and can make a real change. And we introduced some, I got obsessed with evidence-based work, I can tell you. And I'm now trying to persuade the government to reintroduce evidence-based work. I just don't think we got time to, you know, let every flower bloom and try and work out what's working and what isn't. We know what works, let's get on with it. And there are some cabinet members who understand that very well, and I make sure they do.
I'm sure you hold that. I'm sure, quite sure. I'm quite sure you hold plenty of feet to plenty of fires, Hilary. But there have been so many efforts in this area. I mean, you obviously speak from that point at which you know, many of us here will remember under Tony Blair's government, there was that moment and that conversation that opened around exclusion and inclusion. But there have been under, you know, governments of different hues, they've tried to open up that conversation, whether it's called inclusion, levelling up. Baroness Casey did a review in 2015 with a whole host of recommendations which chime actually with a lot of the stuff that we're hearing today, but so often they get ignored. With so many other big things weighing on government now, there is clearly a risk of them endlessly slipping down the agenda.
Oh, there is. I mean, I recruited Louise to government, so she's all my fault. But she and I did all of the rough sleepers stuff. And, you know, we did actually sort it in those days. You wouldn't believe it now, because it's worse now than it was then. But her report in 2015 on the whole thing about integration and so on was very, very important. And I'm afraid none of it was implemented. And had that been implemented, we would be in a very different space now. And it is about having confidence, about having honest conversations with folk. It's one of the things they said to us yesterday in Wigan, that some of the stuff they're trying to do is not easy. But you have to have a very honest conversation with people so that you're not kidding them, and it's not just strap lines and headlines. It's a real discussion about what the issues are and what the potential solutions are, and work with them to find those solutions. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world now where that is very difficult, because you say anything and it's immediately rubbished by the commentariat. You know, I'm not just blaming the press, social media. I had a dreadful story this week about a town in the northeast where they are really working hard together to improve the town centre, where the council have been doing what most people think is quite a good job. The business improvement district of the shop owners and the business owners around the town centre have been part of it, and they're really pleased with what's going on. There's a guy running a Facebook page attacking it, and he therefore solicits a whole series of negative views. And they went to see him from the Business Improvement District and said, can you not, is there anything we can do to persuade you to stop doing this? And he said, yeah, you can give me £3,000 a month. He said, I make money from that because I get payments from Facebook's advertisers.
Fascinating, fascinating.
So, you know, there are things that we have to have a conversation about. Yeah. And that should be a conversation in that town about what somebody is doing and the people who are being conned to just tick or, you know, do an emoji or whatever around it.
Fascinating. Okay, let's get some questions from the audience, please. There's a gentleman here on the left. I'm going to take these in groups of 3, and if you could just make them as pithy and as short as possible, we'll cover more ground. Thank you.
So we are doing a AI for Public Good hackathon in Cambridge on June 7th. So we are doing it together with the City Council, and I'm based at the Cambridge Judge Business School. So when you talk about, as part of your committee, do you also recommend these kind of practitioner sort of things? Because you have events and workshops where you can brainstorm, but then the practical aspect of it is like, what can you do with the ideas that come out of these events and workshops? One of the things we are doing is this. Do you make those kind of recommendations as part of your committee?
Okay, well, just hold that thought. Thank you, that's great. And then another, sorry, I'm going to get you. There's another microphone. There's a cluster of little waving forest of hands in there. Just the first 2 along, and then I'll try and get another one in. Thank you.
Hi there. It's just a quick thing about digital exclusion. And I'm a doctor in North East London, and one of my issues is that 100,000 people don't have broadband, 50,000 people don't have smartphones, yet there's a big rush to technologisation of this, of the NHS and the NHS app, which has benefits. I'm also involved in AI and health tech as well. Do you think there should be a digital rights that people should have? Like they should get a smartphone that's independent. They should have broadband. Is that something we have to make sure people are good? Because people like Google, I've talked to them, don't really do anything about this.
Okay, thank you very much. And just the lady next door, thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is, what do you think can be done to help government better tackle long-term problems, long-term decision-making, where, as you've rightly said, you cannot address the problem in a short sort of parliamentary term of 4 to 5 years. It needs to be a sustained solution.
Thank you. They're all great questions. And actually, I suppose the first 2 fit together quite nicely as a twin pack. Hilary.
Okay. On what you're doing in Cambridge, my old boss is very interested in it. I know that, Tony, but and others are, and I know Peter Kyle talks to me about that a bit. What I say about digital inclusion is we have got to get people to the level where they're able to engage with it. And I'll say very quickly in relation to the second question, some of the things that is about. We will never finish because technology will keep changing. And those of you who are involved in AI are going to be way, way beyond. But it was interesting when I was in Newham with these people, they'd loved using AI for their CVs. And one guy said, if I can't get a CV, a job with a CV I've now got, because it's good grammar and it's good spelling and so on, you know, we need in lay people's language what you're doing, because I don't understand anything of the techie world. I need it translating. And as for what is necessary, have a look on the DCIP website. There's a digital action inclusion plan, or something like that it's called, action plan, digital inclusion action plan, and it covers the need for devices. We've now got 2 departments committed to giving their devices over. I'm wanting to have every government department commit to any of their old devices to be given to the bank that will, I don't mean financial bank, I mean the charity that has a system of repurposing them. We will for the NHS, if you have someone who needs to keep their blood monitored for you, they will get a special device which relates to that. I'm not going to allow anybody in the NHS to use people won't do this if it's digital as an excuse.
Does that mean
we've got to get we've got to get everybody able to participate.
But I thought one of the things that leapt out to me there is this notion of having digital rights to an access to a smartphone. I thought was a really interesting.
We are working on that. There are some amazing charities involved, and one of the charities, Good Things, has over 700 hubs in London, and they are bringing out in about next month, in June sometime, a charter for digital rights, which will be very interesting. They based it on the whole stuff about your right to an independent income and the work that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have done on that. So we will be looking at that, but what we will be doing is making sure that there's somebody from the health department, somebody from the job centre, somebody from the Department of Education for skills and training, able to work with every hub so that they either train the trusted person in the hub or they themselves become a trusted person at a particular time in the hub in order to work with people who are frightened of getting access themselves.
And the question
so
about
we'll
the
do
long
all
term,
of that.
and
the long term, that is the real challenge. I cannot sit here and say it's going to be straightforward because we live in a democracy. I don't know another better form of governance than democracies. And in a democracy, you have to be able to change your mind. However, we have the basis, and I do think this can be changed a bit, that if the previous lot have done it, you're not allowed to know the detail of why they decided that. You know, the civil service is not allowed to let you see the discussions on that. It takes 30 years for that. And it does tend to mean that, oh, they did it, it was a bit expensive, we'll just get rid of it. We just got to get more grown up than that in our politics.
Let's get some.
And have those hard discussions and debates about it.
Great. Thank you. Let's get some more questions, because as all
I agree with what you said about Sure Start.
Gosh, there's a voice coming from somewhere. I can't see where it is. Oh, the microphone's already there. Thank you. Sorry.
However, the Americans have also had the same experience with Head Start. Reducing funding in Head Start meant that, and that's where it's been most graphically illustrated, reducing funding on Head Start meant that many years down the line, more people were going into prison, and you were spending a lot more on imprisoning them. So it's a fool's economics to do that. Which brings me back to an issue that was raised this morning. All this costs money. How are you going to persuade the public to spend more money? Either political party that says it's going to spend more money gets crucified at the elections, but a debate needs to be had.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But
Sorry, I'm going to take one more question, the lady in front, and then we'll do those as a twin pack. Sorry, Hilary.
Thank you. My name's Sarah Beeching. I'm the board chair of a state secondary school in London, and I'm really keen to know how we're going to support young people to get access to knowledge about digital technologies. This year, we're facing unfunded pay rises for teachers, crumbling infrastructure in our schools, and every single one of our computers is not Microsoft 11, Windows 11 compliant, which means we have to replace every computer on our premises. And in order to do that, we have to upgrade our Wi-Fi. And to pay for that, we will lose 2 staff on our staff this year. And we're a well-funded school. We pay for all of our pupil premium students. We only, I'm going to say only, have 15% of our student body that are pupil premium. We pay for all of them to have laptops, all of them to have Wi-Fi access at home. Other schools simply cannot afford to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. So much in a nutshell there. We'll just take those two questions together. So first of all, I suppose it's that grown-up conversation about what the public will be willing to pay for, and then an absolute, crystal example of some of the challenges faced by places like schools and beyond.
Yeah, but what I was going to say to the first questioner was that had Sure Start continued properly, we would not have had as many children going into the care system and it being so expensive. And we have absolute proof of that because Leeds City Council refused to close all of their children's centres. You know, it was hard work, but they kept their children's centres going. They were I've not looked at this recently, but 3-4 years ago when I was chairing a committee in the Lords, they were the only area in the country, certainly in England, where the numbers going into the care system had reduced, and they were able to tell me the millions of pounds a year they'd saved. So sometimes the long-term decisions and the preventative decisions actually have benefit. And they would have helped in the school too now, because it would have meant that children had had the right sort of support before they got to school. I think school funding is a real issue and is a real challenge. Every area of funding. It is why I want grown-up conversations with people. It is why I'm quite committed to things like citizens' juries on things like this, where people go through the issues very, very carefully. But that's a lot of hard work for folk.
But I suppose it's the disconnect between having these proposals, and I suppose we can go back to the Casey review on that, and the actual hard realities that were just articulated on the ground as to how you balance your budget in a place like a school, even a well-funded school. If suddenly you've got to fund teachers' pay rises out of that budget, then and you can't upgrade your Microsoft, then this goes back to the joined-up thinking too as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, but it is also about the amount of money we spend as a country and, you know, what bang we get for the buck. And we have to have schools and health. And in health, the big issue is changing the funding flow. I don't know education in this sense, but in health, the money goes into the hospitals, and funding the other programs in primary and in local care is much more difficult. And certainly for some of the good practice at local level, they can't get NHS funding. So I think I'm hoping you'll see something about that in the 10-year plan. We spend a lot of public money. We've got to make sure that public money buys what we want it to buy in the way that is most efficient and does its best by the most disadvantaged. One of my problems is that it is in the most disadvantaged areas that the biggest cuts have been. So in the northeast, which is where I come from, obviously, there was, which has the highest levels of child poverty in the country now, the cuts in local government spending were higher than anywhere else in the country. And that was because everybody thought, because we'd had a fair number of ministers from the northeast in our government, that we'd overfunded the northeast. We hadn't. What we'd done was try to get money to people who were poorer.
Okay.
But you know, they had it taken away from them in the last 15 years.
I'm always keeping an eye on the clock, obviously, Hilary.
Sorry.
No, don't apologise. We could listen. I mean, I think also, I'm sure from the other panels that you've listened to, you would say the same. I think maybe two very quick questions together. If there are some more to come, is there somebody with a microphone already in their hand there? No. Okay. Well, that gives me a chance to. I'm just scanning through and make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay, let's have a wrap-up thought then, Hilary, on that basis. So I think there's a lot for people to think about. What's at stake if your plans for bottom-up, locally led regeneration, reconnection for people is not honoured by this government? What's at stake?
Well, I believe some of it will be honoured, but it is a long-term programme. We are now much more divided in terms of rich and poor than we've been in my lifetime. And we have managed in the past to get more people out of poverty and into work and into long-term sustainable jobs. We've always had this residual bit at the bottom. And what's happened is that residual bit has grown in the last decade. And that makes us more divided and unequal than ever before. And that doesn't do any of us any good. And so in the long term, what we need is this recognition in this country that unless we are more equal and have more opportunities for everyone, that actually affects everyone. And the people who've got means need to understand that for their children and their children's children, it's not a long-term sustainable solution to have some people doing fine and the rest not.
Baroness Hilary Armstrong, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Quick refresh, quick change of panel. Hope you're having a great day and lots to think about for those of you who are in the room with Baroness Hilary Armstrong as a result of her remarks. I think actually feeding quite nicely to this next session, given the story she told me about pushback from Facebook groups and how social media has been interacting with, you know, her work in the real world. I thought was very interesting. So this is our Fellows Festival panel discussion on arguably one of the most pressing and complex issues and questions of our time when it comes to social cohesion. In an era of deep polarisation set against a backdrop of breakneck change in our media landscape, How can freedom of speech help rather than hinder the connections between us? What is the balance between free speech and social cohesion? Even the debate around freedom of speech is polarised and politicised. It's on the front page. I don't know if you've seen the copy of The Economist this week, but they're leading on it this week. Given rocket boosters, of course, by J.D. Vance's accusation that in Europe and specifically here in the UK, it's under threat. So what are the biggest challenges to free speech in the UK? What kind of institutions, cultures and practices do we need to support a truly open yet cohesive society? The challenge has been laid bare by the Director General of the BBC this week when he said Britain's status as a cohesive democratic society is at risk for the first time in a generation as the rise of social media platforms and disinformation fuel a trust crisis. So it is clearly actually at the very heart of what we've been discussing in all of our panels today. We've got a really provocative and insightful panel to take us through it. Baroness Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas, which for more than 20 years has been committed to organising free and open public debate. Claire's a former MEP, public intellectual, who's long championed freedom expression and open debate. Myriam Francois, on the end there, writer, broadcaster and academic, whose work has appeared on the BBC, Al Jazeera and others. She also has her own programme on YouTube, The Tea. You explore race, identity, free speech throughout your work. Myriam, thank you for joining us. And Stephen Sackur, veteran journalist and former host of the BBC's Hard Talk programme, which will be one of the things that we'll be talking to him about, of course, which was, of course, famous for its in-depth and news-making interviews with global leaders. So whether it's policemen door-knocking over someone's tweets, the spread of disinformation during the summer riots, cancel culture, debate over legitimate protest on our streets, it feels a pretty febrile time. So let's just get a take on where our panel think where we're at. And I'll just start with you, Claire.
So I think on this point, and maybe only on this point, I agree with J.D. Vance. I mean, I do think there is a serious problem of free speech, and I was interested in The Economist, of all magazines or publications, coming out and saying that there's a problem of free speech, and that actually, or rather, there's a problem in the attacks on free speech. And this is the most important thing The Economist said, which is it said that hate speech, once it's treated by law, actually is an attack on people's freedom to think aloud, to openly ask questions, and that that's a real problem. Because one of the things that's most extraordinary is that people will say to me, oh, you just want free speech so that you can spout hate speech. And that is, in a way, what's happened is free speech itself has become part of the culture wars, and if you're a free speecher, you're seen as somehow a bit dodgy. And then if you think about the definition, and I won't monopolise because I'm dying to hear from the others, but when you think about what constitutes hate speech, we might all think we can agree that we don't want to hear this kind of speech until you discover that if you put up a social media post welcoming the Supreme Court's clarification on the distinction between biological sex and gender, that you're accused of celebrating transphobic hate speech. And they think, no, actually, I was just saying that I agreed with the Supreme Court's decision. And so any number of things, 30 people a day are arrested for speech crimes in this country. That's a hell of a lot in a free society. And it makes you worry that we're not so free.
OK, thank you, Stephen.
Well, I agree with loads that Claire has just said. I think free speech is one of those things. I mean, if you said you were against free speech, you would, I think, find very little support in a room. And that would be quite right, because who would want to be against free speech? The idea itself sounds like it's a fundamentally important part of sort of human society. So I'm fundamentally pro-free speech. Am I an absolutist? Probably not, because in most things in life, I tend, through experience and my own sort of reading and reflection, believe that the extremes aren't really the best places to occupy. I tend to think most issues in the end defy binary solutions, simplistic solutions, And therefore, I don't really buy the idea that there is a sort of line that one can draw between free speech and unacceptable hate speech or incitement. I think there are lots of gray areas, and then we human beings have to use our intelligence, our sensitivity to try and navigate through them. I think because that's quite nuanced, law is a very difficult thing to use to approach that problem. So nonetheless, we have to try and do it. You know, as a society, we'd have to make sure that while we keep speech as free as possible, we do not license people to incite hate, to defy the truth in a way that actually is damaging, whether it be with absolutely false medical information, which, you know, pollutes the debate about vaccines or anything else. So it's a long-winded way of saying I don't like using the law unless it's absolutely necessary. I think when it comes to inciting violence, it is necessary. But I spent 5 years of my life as a journalist in the United States. I like the First Amendment. I like as much freedom as possible. And so while recognizing the nuance, that's where I sit.
Okay, thank you, Myriam.
Thank you. I'm probably just going to build a bit because you've said a lot of things that I really fundamentally agree with, but I think the issue of free speech is part of a wider civil liberties crisis that has been revealed to us most profoundly over the last 20 months through the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the reality of the people's attempts to object to that in various capacities. You know, amongst them, of course, has been, you know, huge criminalization of people expressing sentiments online, which we've already touched on. And beyond that, the criminalization of protests, which hopefully I think we'll also talk about. I think what's been very interesting has been looking at the ways in which certain laws that were allegedly designed to protect minorities from hate speech have in many cases been used actually as a baton to beat them with. And so it's very interesting to me to take concrete examples in this regard. So a black person on Twitter who'd used the N-word, for example, being interrogated by 2 white police officers about their use of that word in relation to another black person. To your point about who gets to decide what is and isn't within, you know, a form of hate speech, you know, Maria Hussein, a teacher who had attended a protest holding a placard talking about coconuts in reference to a political identity of people who are upholding forms of white supremacy despite being of an ethnic minority background, has been the subject of a police investigation. She's lost her job. She has been through hell and back. She's had people turning up at her door over a tweet. So there are massive issues to do with free speech, not just to do with Palestine, but I think the Palestine issue has really revealed to us the depths of in which we've fallen. Okay, and it's important at that point to say, of course, the use of the word genocide has been matter of debate in Parliament. It has been rejected by this government. I mean, they have zero authority. I'm just 500 RAF flights to provide weapons. 2 million people starving to death as we speak. I'm also moderating this from a point of view. I understand, but at a certain neutral point of view on the language that is used. So when a genocide has been defined as such by over 200 genocide experts, I'm afraid the government does not have the moral authority to go and speak over that. I'm simply providing the backdrop to this. For sure, but simply providing the backdrop to conversation. Claire.
Well, listen, I actually think it's a good example of why free speech is difficult. One of the things that happens is people say, I believe in free speech for me and my tribe, but not for thee and your tribe. Now, as it happens, I am on the absolute... No, I'm not disagreeing with you, just on this bit. I totally and profoundly disagree with you on the use of the term genocide, but I'm not trying to stop you saying it. I completely am on the other side in relation to the war in Gaza, I know. But there's no side. There is a genocide. Just hold on. Genocide experts. No, we just talking, of which you are not one. Sorry, hang on a minute. Sorry, I am quite used to moderating spiky conversations. Just let Claire finish, because this is actually what we're on about, effectively. Exactly. No, but we're on different sides. But no, we're not. Just hold on. We are, and we'll cope. And the audience will cope with working out, listening to both of us, what we think about various things. Where I get nervous is when somebody else, I'm glad that we've got you moderating this debate, but I do not generally want somebody to moderate in such a way as that conversation can't happen, because it's very important. So you use the example, Myriam, of the coconut tweet. I thought it was beyond distasteful to call somebody a coconut because of the colour of their skin, and they had the wrong political views, and they had a placard. I despised it, but I defended their use of it, and I condemned the attempt at getting that person sent to prison. So that's what free speech is all about. You have to say, I support free speech for those people whose views I find abhorrent, obnoxious, and so on. So then we get on to just only one tiny bit. I think that we should have very tightly drawn laws on inciting violence, but I think that we have to be very careful about the notion of a law that says we shouldn't incite hate, because the notion of what is hateful is so subjective and is therefore used to sweep up any range of opinions that you happen to disagree with.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And I think that just took us, even this in that exchange, took us to the heart of why this is such a difficult question.
It was a beautiful illustration, I think,
absolutely
of why we need to listen to each other, and people can sit on a panel and have absolutely very different opinions about, said issue, but they, as long as they are given the freedom to make their points, they can leave the room still deeply disagreeing with each other, but hopefully some light as well as heat has been shed, and that's why free speech matters so much.
And it's what you're both journalists, and you're one of the most eloquent supporters of this sort of exchange, Claire. I suppose the thing I need to sort of accelerate to, given the overarching theme of today, and that is that question of connection, is how this then exists in a space where, God knows, we need a path forward to cohesion. And I suppose actually there are very many institutions, cultures, ways and formats that we can look at to try to encourage that. Public service broadcasting is one of those arenas, Stephen. I just wonder, how do you marry that arena of free speech with a place where people can genuinely feel that they're all part of the same whole?
I mean, it's a really important question. I guess my fundamental approach to this is that, I'm a journalist. I hope to do other things in my life, but I've been a journalist a long time. And as a journalist, I don't think it's my job to feel that part of the remit is promote social cohesion. That's not really why I went into journalism, what I think my journalism is about. One would like to live in a cohesive society, but if one doesn't live in a cohesive society, as a reporter, I have to report on that too. So I think, one needs to be clear about what the job of, the journalist is, the media organization. It's not to build a society, it's to reflect a society, it's to be responsible, it's to have, fundamental values like, truth-telling, integrity, impartiality, trustworthiness, proving that honesty is a fundamental part of the remit of your journalism. All of that really matters. But whether, we have to take on board the notion that we are part of, a society building exercise to make sure that everybody gets along with each other, I don't really feel that's where I've been or where I should be.
No, and I suppose that's very specifically about one's work as a journalist, but I suppose I was thinking about it in the broader sense of, the BBC and its public service remit, the public service broadcasters in this country. I'm at ITN, ITV is one of them, and it's how these public service arenas exist and honour the sort of conflict of opinion and free speech, I suppose, is a question mark.
I think
I'll come back to Claire then.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
Briefly, Stephen, then I'll come back to Claire.
Well, I
Myriam.
think the BBC in particular, but I'm sure you would say the same, Julia, at ITN, you have a duty to reflect the huge diversity, range of opinions across the nation, or indeed, as I've worked a lot for the international BBC, across the world. You need to truly try to reflect the range of opinion that's out there, and do it in a fair and responsible way. And then I think the other thing that one has to say about media organizations is they have to be, as Tim Davey was saying the other day, they have to be trustworthy. You know, people have to believe that you go out, you fact find, you don't try and sort of twist the truth, manipulate the truth, or distort what you see. You bear witness, and that element of being trustworthy is a hugely important pillar of a, you know, a functional democratic society.
Which, of course, we know the BBC has lost over the Gaza issue because of the misinformation that has been spread around this issue. Not least, of course, is the fact that whilst we can sit here and debate and argue over the word genocide, the reality is that there are 2 million people in Gaza right now who have not had any food, medical aid or clean water for the last 60 days. 60 days, and there is no effort right now to break that. The fact that we would sit here and argue about the semantics of the language associated with that is the problem. It is the problem. It's why people don't trust the BBC today. It's also because, in all reality, for those of us who've worked inside on the BBC, there has been huge sedition on the inside because people are aware of efforts to meddle with editorial standards within the BBC when it comes to Palestine. There is a skewed narrative towards the Israeli perspective and a failure to hold Israeli officials to account to the same standard that we would any other government in the world that was actively exterminating a civilian population with nowhere to flee. Okay. We are not seeing that, and that's where the lack of trust is coming. Okay, and the risk of that with regards to public broadcasting specifically is that we then have people turning to online sources that do not have a commitment to Ofcom, do not have a commitment to any form of impartiality, and that they are then not actually seeing alternative perspectives at all, which, of course, the algorithm also doesn't help.
OK, well, I'm really interested to talk about the algorithm. I also have to say, of course, the BBC isn't here to answer for it. But
see, the thing is, there's lots that you just said, Myriam, and it'd be really interesting to have that debate, because there's lots I agree with you on, and there's lots I would pick up on. I mean, I don't work for the BBC anymore. I used to till very recently. But I don't know that we should spend the entire debate talking specifically about that, but I would love to follow up on that.
Follow up.
Well, I'm also keen that other people get a chance to ask questions, and Claire just wanted to come in on that point. So thank you, Myriam.
So I think that you said, Stephen, a very important point when you said it's not up to the BBC to solve the problem of social cohesion, because one of the things that makes me nervous is that actually public service broadcasters have started to act as though it is their job to resolve a range of political issues. And I don't want them to start trying to think that they can resolve the issues in the Middle East either, by the way. That's not their job. You know, I don't care what we have as a civil society argue over, and there's wars going on. It's up to public service broadcasters to reflect the debates. What's happened is that actually, too often, broadcasters and the media in general say, oh, we're worried about the toxic, polarised atmosphere in society. So what we're going to do is to actually sideline certain voices in case it makes it worse, because we want to contribute to social cohesion. And it's like, well, don't do that, because that's actually you trying to manipulate politically the outcome of your viewers' politics, and that's not what your job's there to do. I think that one of the things that's happened is people feel resentful of, for example, ironically, fact checkers. Because they do think, oh, God, apart from the fact that the fact checkers don't always get the facts right and seem to have a rather selective view of which misinformation they are going to highlight and ignore other bits of misinformation which they somehow they think helps social cohesion, so they don't bother. Even the medical misinformation you talked about, as we know, for example, the source of the COVID leak in terms of the Wuhan lab, that was suppressed on active intervention by, for example, advice of government. I don't necessarily mean by the BBC, but, when you sort of get told, you can't ask that question because you're a conspiratorial lunatic influenced by Russian bots, and then you find out that actually it might have been true, you feel as though you've been taken for a ride. So I'm only raising, funny enough, COVID's now become the non-contentious example of what I can use, right? Because half of the other things I'm going to say will get me either lynched or applauded. So what I'm trying to say is people feel at the moment as though they're being shaped by people who think they know best. And when you feel like that, you will go to rabbit hole dodginess. And I understand why, because you're so frustrated.
Okay, Stephen, quickly, then I want to open to the floor for questions.
You raise lots of interesting examples there, and again, I'm loving this because I'm kind of agreeing with everybody, even though there's some heat up here. I'm sort of thinking, oh, well, I agree with that, and I agree with that. But there are still such things as facts, right?
I agree.
There are facts.
Please, but the thing is, you've got to recognise that when one queries fact checkers in the misinformation regime, it's not because one is a relativistic anti-fact person.
Not at all.
Of course,
but there are
nobody
such
doesn't
people
agree
out there. There are people who, even when irrefutable evidence to back a fact is presented, refuse to regard it as a fact and call it fake. I mean, there just are lots of these people.
But we have to be very careful, because the role of public service broadcasters is surely to be careful that it doesn't simply imply that anyone who queries truth-seeking is one of those fringe people. Right? That's my problem is you get demonised as being a conspiratorial nutter if you want to actually say it's a bit more complicated than that. Stop banning things.
Okay. We haven't spoken about proximity to government in public broadcasting, which I think is actually part of the issue that you're referring to, Claire. And clearly we do have issues like, Tim Davie obviously being somebody who had run as a Conservative candidate, Andrew Neil simultaneously being an editor at The Spectator. There are all kinds of ways in which we could say that there are people who are working in
some people might allege had an influence,
Well, not just, that would be considered a conflict of interest in any other position. And I would argue within this one too. So this is why I'm saying the proximity of public broadcasting editorial leadership to the government is a real form of intrusion into the ability of journalists much further down the chain to actually tell the stories.
Okay. I think there's so many issues that get raised at almost every turn there. I'm not quite where to
it's a big subject.
It is an extraordinarily complex subject, but I suppose the thing that I'm trying to bring it back together again is just where this balance is, because we've got to have these debates quite clearly. There needs to be, surely, whether or not you regard a public service broadcaster as being too close to the mission of trying to do some social good whilst they're at it. There needs to be somewhere where there is, at least you can have as much trust as possible for your information. And I suppose that's, I suppose as somebody at a public service broadcaster, you're never going to get it right 100%, but there is a space there.
It's a question. I suppose our question, is whether it's changed or got worse. I mean, I think that I've gone from being an absolute obsessive BBC defender to feeling much more cynical. And, for want of a better term, people sort of think, oh, that means you now listen and watch GB News all the time. I have occasionally watched GB News and been on it, but actually what I've done is I've started listening to Times Radio a lot more.
Oh,
so this
good,
is hardly...
I'm going to be on there.
I know you are.
Oh, jolly good, Stephen.
No disrespect, Stephen. It's not because of you that I've started listening to it. But what I'm saying is that my big revolution is I've moved from the BBC Radio 4 to Times Radio. But when I say I disagree with BBC Radio 4 and I don't trust it all the time, people say, oh, well, that's because you're on that GB News and you've gone far-right lunatic, right? And it's just galling because you go, no.
It's not so much
I believe in media diversity.
What you choose to watch or not. It's the question of what the alternative to public broadcasters with a commitment to trying to serve the public good, what the alternative to that is. And the alternative to that is very wealthy private individuals running private networks to advance private agendas. And I can assure you that however many issues you may have with the BBC, they are very far removed from the total lack of accountability that we have from GB News and Talk TV or whatever these other personal agenda-driven, yes, exactly. These are personal agenda-driven networks with the very clear objective of dividing our societies to advance political goals. They are a real threat to social cohesion. You want to talk about something? Let's talk about the millionaires funding pet media projects to divide our societies so they can push their agendas. That's a real threat to our society.
I mean, but it's all very complicated. I mean, some of the... in the end, what I come back to time and again is that when it comes to trust and the way in which we can be a positive in society as disseminators of news and information, it's on trying to establish, through evidence, facts, to find a way that a society can share a consensual understanding of stuff that is true. And yes, the BBC, I still believe, despite, you know, having some sympathy with some of what you've said, Myriam, about the BBC, on the whole, I think is still an important player in that arena and positive player to a large extent. But, you know, other players that are in the private sector are hugely important too. The New York Times is privately owned, but it does some terrible reporting at times, but it does some great reporting too. Even, God help us, the Jeff Bezos-owned Washington Post, which sadly has taken a very sad turn, in my opinion, still does some great reporting. It's not like, you know, private media organizations can't actually still contribute to the greater good when it comes to
the same Washington Post that is not allowed to cover stories critical of
There's some terrible stuff going on at the Washington Post, but all I'm saying is there's also some great reporting.
He did acknowledge that.
It's impossible to have both.
Okay,
right, here we go. This is really interesting. But I think this is also begs the big question about media literacy and where, you know, when we're talking about for a young person navigating this increasingly complex society, actually understanding that broad ecology of what is there as an offer is something that is a crucial tool. It's crucial to have that in your back pocket as a navigation tool to get through it and to know where you can get the broadest picture possible, the fairest picture possible to form your views.
This is a funny little story. I used to recommend my students who did English A-level, to watch Hard Talk to improve their media literacy.
Yeah.
Well done, BBC, by the way.
Agreed.
Okay, right, we must get some questions. Woo! Let's get some questions. I'm going to take 3 together and really short, sharp questions because we're always up against the clock. The lady there with the glasses, first of all, and gentleman here on the front. Oh, no, well, then Sabah, who I said hello to earlier. But first of all, the lady behind, just a really pithy, short question, please.
This may sound a bit odd, but we're in a room of intelligent, careful people who read a lot of things. I read The Conversation, amongst other things, but Claire, you said you go to a variety of sources. It's my understanding, and I'm not terribly literate in the area of social media, but TikTok is training people to have a 3-minute attention span. And that's the kind of thing where you end up in an echo chamber and you go right down that route. And that really, in my view, is possibly more dangerous. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I think Myriam probably have something to say on that.
To that point, social media needs to be talked about.
Sorry.
Mine's a very simple one, which is I think free speech is being used towards malicious communication, and people are hiding behind that. And there was a comment made by one of the panelists earlier which used an inflammatory term which can lead to hate speech.
Thank you very much. And sorry, I think we're just going to take... The gentleman here was going to ask a question too.
How do we deal with free speech hypocrisy? So the sort of culture war warriors who often attack what they see as limits on free speech will also condemn free speech when it suits them. And the lovely example of that recently, we had Charlie Mullins of Pimlico Plumbers saying, will somebody just kill Sadiq
Okay,
Khan?
yeah, we'll just be careful what we say in a public space. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And then we had a furore over kneecap, supposedly saying kill the Tories. And the reaction on each side of politics was to condemn the bit they don't like and hold up as an example of free speech the bit they do like.
Thank you. I think that was to Claire's immediate point. If there has been an offensive term used in your view, I just want to say, this is part of our conversation, but we're always very aware of what is said in a space like this. Let's go to that point about TikTok first, if we may. And Myriam, I was going to come to you on that because we were having a chat before this, and you have a program on YouTube, and you were explaining to me that it's slightly adjacent to that, but the fact that YouTube has an algorithm that will attract or connect you to other certain broadcasts means that it creates, in your view, an echo chamber about the conversations that you're having. It also goes to the point that this lady was making about attention spans. It's how some of these social media channels and some of these channels are now, in your view and in others, shaping the way we understand and engage with communications and conversations.
I mean, without a doubt. And I think to connect it to our previous discussion on public broadcasting, for all its faults, has a mandate, which is to serve us, the public, and it does it more or less well, and we've discussed that. Once you enter the realm of social media platforms, you are dealing with commercially driven organizations who have one simple goal, and that is to keep you glued to the screen as long as possible. And the way they do that is not necessarily by continuously providing you with really thought-provoking, diverse perspectives that you need to engage with, but typically by making sure that you engage with probably a lot of things that make you either deeply angry or confirm what you already believe, both of which obviously contribute highly negatively to social cohesion, but also to your earlier point in the question when you're asking about young people and how do younger audiences who don't watch the BBC, don't take most of their information from digital platforms. TikTok is actually brilliant. I highly recommend you get on TikTok. But it has issues with absolutely training young minds, and YouTube Shorts is the same through the swiping to kind of focus on 3-minute information. But you'll also find, if I may, fantastic young people making really great educational content in really short formats to help their peers understand things about the world. And it is why it's partly so popular. But we do have a problem, and it's to do with the regulation of the platforms themselves. These platforms are now so integrated in our lives, and there is zero oversight, partly because we are so behind technologically. I've sat in on discussions with these tech companies, with ministers, where the tech companies are basically saying to them, laughing at the idea that we're going to be regulating them, saying to them, you come to us for help. We're 10 steps ahead of you at all times. They are actually quite a scary and very real threat to our societies. And I think not just in the area of free speech, but specifically in this area for sure.
Okay, well, there are the flip side of that, of course, and actually what we were hearing from Baroness Armstrong was that also the flip side is that there is a space for communication and, I suppose, cohesion and a way of connecting people, and especially those who can feel left behind in some of our communities. Just to pick up on the point that you raised, goes also to what you kicked off with, Claire, really, is that, you know, it is that question over what we now term as hate speech. There are very clear laws around incitement. But how would you propose to navigate that?
Well, I think, first of all, I do not think we have got very clear laws on incitement to hate. And in fact, lots of lawyers say the same. I mean, this isn't just me going on some free speech absolutist point. There was an appeal against Lucy Connolly, who wrote a vile Facebook tweet in relation to the Southport riots, which she has been put in jail for 31 months. Ironically, somebody who actually went and attacked the mosque in Southport, actually physically attacked it, gone 28 months. So something's a bit peculiar there. And a lot of people were imprisoned for their social media posts in a highly... So the point is some of it was hateful, but as I indicated, I don't think all of it was. Just on double standards, by the way, we can spend a lot of time in places like this worrying about youth being trained on TikTok into having low attention spans, and it means that they're going to end up in echo chambers. No disrespect, but you don't have to be young and spend a lot of time on TikTok to end up in an echo chamber, right? And I'm quite serious. One of the problems we've got is that people don't know they're in an echo chamber. They assume that they're the righteous ones and everyone else has been corrupted by TikTok or hate speech, or because they've read the wrong blog, or because, I don't know, they've come to a Academy of Ideas organised Battle of Ideas festival and look at our YouTube, and therefore they're bound to be peculiar. But actually, everybody has a responsibility to get out more. And the BBC, if it's guilty of anything for me, is that there's a sort of sense of we are the righteous, and you know, everybody thinks fairly similarly within a certain spectrum. I'm not trying to be funny, but I do sometimes think that you do think, honestly, the world is full of a variety of views, and whether you like it or not, recent political events have indicated, local elections, blah, blah, blah. Oh my God, who are those people who are voting that way? Who are they? Who are they? Well, they're your neighbours and fellow citizens, and you better get used to it.
Sorry, Julie, but
no.
just...
Sorry. But I'm going to get some more questions in there.
One word that don't think any of us have actually used, but I think it's quite an important word, is confidence. You know, a confident society, and certainly, you know, a confident set of people working in the information space believe that, you know, in the end, you reflect a diversity of views, you let free speech reign as much as you possibly can, confident that the society will have enough sort of stress test within it, or enough sort of ability to withstand the pressures and the strains. It can stretch, it can be like a sort of springy net, or whatever stupid metaphor you want to come up with, to cope with all this. I instinctively am quite a confident person that society can cope with this cacophony of different views and, you know, extremes, and that by and large, rather than try to, you know, put some sort of muzzle on some of this stuff, try as much as possible not to use the muzzle. At some point you do have to use the muzzle, but be confident enough to keep the muzzle for the sort of special occasion.
Yeah, and just expose as many arguments to as wide a range of scrutiny as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is obviously when the government itself is stoking the division, which, you know, I would say is a big part of the problem that we have right now. You know, like, it's the immigrants, like, you know, most of us actually don't give a shit about that debate, that you care about that debate because you can't own a house, because you cannot afford to feed your kids, because you are constantly faced with an economic struggle, and you're thinking to yourself, how are we taking in more people when clearly we don't have enough? We don't have enough because you're not taxing the rich properly, because you're allowing people, big corporations, to be offshore in ways that they benefit from the skill set of the people in this country, but don't give back to it. And then the government comes in and jumps on the bloody reform bandwagon. It's absolutely shameful.
Okay,
it's not the algorithm. It's you lot doing it.
No, Frank, we get some more questions. Thank you.
And it needs to be heard alongside many others.
Thank you. There's a lady here, and then two gentlemen at the back, please.
Is that working? On the BBC at the moment, and I really do back the BBC, but I'll be interested in your view, because I'm worried that there's a trailer with the brilliant Clive Myrie who's telling us that they are the most trusted, that they're doing all this. And I just wonder whether it's more approach of they've got this have your say and they're trying to ask people to maybe put it more humbly rather than saying we are this.
I quite agree.
I think it sort of happens.
I can't stand that trailer. It drives me bonkers. And you know what? A really confident organisation wouldn't need to do that.
Or stop blocking all the films on Gaza.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Totally agree.
Just two more questions from the back, please.
So we've got free speech on one side, cohesion on the other, but I've been trying to think about the bit in the middle, the verses. Is it a confrontation between the two? For free speech to win, must cohesion lose? If cohesion wins, must it defeat free speech? No. Or can we have a result that's a kind of thrilling score?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, thank
totally you can.
Gentleman in front, and then we'll take that up.
That's why you have to have the confidence to believe that there is a space
there's just a gentleman
where
straight
both
in front there.
Hold good.
Yeah.
This is just a general question for the whole panel. So I'm a fellow of the Landscape Institute, and I'm part of the environmental landscape sector. And we're always about inclusion and diversity, essentially. I guess one of the biggest challenges, I guess, globally is how do we tackle deepfakes and things like fake news? Because that narrative itself, it's a real danger to actually free speech itself.
Thank you very much. And actually, we'll take those three questions together, but the lady who started on that, the advert about trust and that question about fake news, they're two sides of that same coin, aren't they? And exactly what the BBC is trying to address with that.
No, totally. I mean, I'm absolutely with you. I think the trailer's ridiculous. Humility is a good thing. Hubris is a bad thing. And also, frankly, you know, the BBC now makes a big palaver about certain stories they present being verified, and they have this big verify banner, which just worries the hell out of me, because I think, what, are we saying that the rest of our stories aren't actually really verified at all? We're just chucking it out there.
Do you not think the BBC should be doing that at all?
No, I think it's ridiculous. I think, again, it's about confidence. I want all of us to be confident that the BBC runs a journalistic operation where stuff is verified. You don't have to sort of label it as such. It shouldn't be on the BBC unless it's been verified, and it's, you know, as best we can find it, the best obtainable version of the truth. That Carl Bernstein taught me that phrase when I was talking to him about Watergate and all of the trails he and Woodward had standing up their stories back in 73, 74. And, you know, he said, what journalism is about is the best obtainable version of the truth. I think it's a great phrase because it's not full of hubris. It's not suggesting there is a truth that everybody, you know, should regard as self-evident. But that's what we are about. And, you know, within that framework, I think fake news, the dissemination of lies, has to be called out. That's why I think news organizations, whether they be publicly funded or private, need to spend an awful lot of time on the fact-checking, the dirty, tedious work of journalism, which is simply to make sure that you deliver the best obtainable version of the truth.
Thank you. And just to go back to the gentleman's question at the very back about can these two questions even exist in the same space? Can you have that cohesion, that connection with the full breadth of free speech? I suppose that's ultimately, it brings us back to where we started.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think you cannot have cohesion unless you have free speech. Because the assumption is that cohesion can only happen if you've got one version of the truth. And that is actually an authoritarian view. And, you know, this is the confidence question. We need to have confidence as a society that you can hear a wide variety of views, and if somebody says something that you find offensive, that you're not going to have a panic attack or report them to the police, or if you see somebody with Brexit books on their shelves, that you're not going to kind of get on and go, oh my God, as happened recently with the police saying wrong kind of literature. We have to be able to accept there's a wide variety of views, and as it were, thrash them out. It's called democracy. Do you remember that thing where there's different views having to compete with one another? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you actually approach it as that social cohesion can only happen by the suppression of certain views, what happens is that those views are not defeated intellectually or emotionally or anything. They are banned, censored, sidelined, treated with contempt, and guess what? They fester. And in the old days, they used to fester with people kind of like gathering on corners and having a chat about it. Now they fester and emerge as a Substack or, you know, as a social media platform or something. In other words, they've got an expression. And I don't blame people. So in other words, censorship is when you lack confidence, in my view. It's when society doesn't know how to cope with ordinary people expressing things maybe awkwardly. They haven't been on the latest diversity, equality and inclusion training course run by HR. They get the language all muddled and jumbled. But that's not hate speech. That's people speaking from the heart and openly. And the final thing, you have to be able to think out loud. And thinking out loud means you say stupid things and make mistakes. But that's how you experiment. That's the whole point of a democratic society. That you can say, what about this? And somebody goes, don't be ridiculous, what a stupid idea. If you're not allowed to say it, apart from to your mates who's, you know, then actually you'll never be challenged. So you only can change your mind in other people's minds by free speech. That's get social cohesion based on that, is what democracy is.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm also conscious of more panels, more time for other discussions this afternoon. So I suppose I'd just like to, it was a good all-encompassing thought to finish on there, really, Claire. But I suppose just to give both Myriam and Stephen a final gambit before we move on to look at other areas that need examining and thrashing out in terms of how we can begin to live in a less divided society, which has direct consequences for a lot of the communities that are represented here today and that we've talked about today. What's a parting thought, a line from you both?
Well, yeah, just on the question about sort of free speech and cohesion and whether there's a space in the middle. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game to me. In fact, you know, as Claire's already put it very well, I actually think that cohesion requires free speech and requires that confidence that I've been banging on about. One thing we haven't really discussed, which I just very briefly throw out at the end, is that I think we need to be really clear, you know, that there's opinion and then there's news or fact dissemination, and they're two different things. And right now, my fear is that a lot of people are sort of muddling them up. Because I know I'm very boring, but I keep coming back to this thing. Facts matter, and evidential-based information really matters. And that's a thing, and then opinion is something else. I don't really care. People can have all sorts of opinions, as long as they're not inciting violence. You know, I'm prepared to listen to them. I'll tell them if I disagree, and that's fine. But what I really care about is people presenting facts, masquerading as facts when in fact they're not facts. They are really damaging, corrosive lies, fakes, misinformation. And I think that is something that is really worrying me about the information space at the moment.
Okay, just very briefly, Myriam.
Yeah, so there are some very obviously real threats to freedom of speech that we face in this country. I think it's really urgent that we consider them. One of them that I'd like to obviously mention is the government's attempt to push through the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which would see any criticism of the state of Israel conflated with anti-Semitism. And I'm sure it's fairly obvious by now why that would be profoundly detrimental to our ability to hold governments accountable for their actions. Just as it's not Islamophobic to criticize the government of Saudi Arabia, it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the government of Israel, and we must retain the ability and right to do that and not use free speech to try and silence that.
Okay.
I also want to put forward very quickly...
On the broader concluding point,
the one
rather
I'm
than
getting
a specific, thanks.
Yeah. There was a point raised around the interplay between the free speech and social cohesion. The thing we're obviously not talking about is downstream education and the way in which education is really being, neutered in this country. So the reality is now that in higher education, most people cannot go into higher education unless you're from a wealthy background or you're willing to take on a huge amount of debt. For that reason, we're having more and more young people having to make the choice of not going into spaces where typically, after you finished school, you would go into an environment where you would meet people of different backgrounds, of different opinions, and you would have to get on with them and rub shoulders and debate and argue, and you would learn what it means to be in a society where you respect one another despite those differences. Less and less young people are able to do that. Education is being commercialized in a way that is to the detriment of the majority of people in this country, and that is where further upstream we come to an inability of people to recognize fake news, which is getting more and more sophisticated, but also disinformation from governments and, in some cases, sadly, from the public broadcaster.
So actually, that better sense of community, a better mix and an eye on that from an early stage.
Absolutely.
The better communication, person to person, which is effectively what we're about today. Thank you very much. It feels like we've done a whistle stop. Really great to hear. Claire, Stephen and Myriam, thank you. Quite a lot of food for thought, I think we can safely say. Hope you've enjoyed that session and the sessions to come. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's a self-hushing room. Very good. Thank you. Making my job easy. Welcome back, everyone. This is the final session. I have to say, one I've been massively looking forward to because education, entirely predictably, has been an absolute core theme through the day. The importance of it to all that we've been discussing in terms of social connection, social capital, and social innovation. And there are not two better people in the country to discuss it than our two panelists on the stage with me now, Peter Hyman, Lucy Heller. I will not introduce them because they can tell their story about them much better than I can tell their story about them. I'm going to pass the floor to them and then I'm going to go to the audience really early on so it becomes a genuine conversation in the room about whether education and how we change it to make good on all the things we've been discussing today. And Peter, can I start with you? Welcome both. By the way, round of applause for our panel. I did a pre-applause.
Good. Well, it's lovely to be here. Lovely to see you all. And I've been here all day. It's been a fantastic day of insights and ideas. So thank you very much for that, Andy, and your team. So I'll do the biog bit very quickly just to put me in context. I worked for Tony Blair for nearly 10 years as a speechwriter and a strategist. I then left and immediately became a teaching assistant and was hopelessly out of my depth in a tough inner city school. I trained as a history teacher, then became a head teacher, setting up a school in East London, a 4 to 18 school called School 21. And then set up a group of schools that we call the umbrella organisation Big Education. And then founded a charity, Voice 21, that deals in speaking skills and oracy, which is working in more than 1,000 schools across the country. And I want to come back to oracy in a second, which I think is increasingly important. Then I went back into politics. The last 2 years before the election, I was working for Keir Starmer and helped devise the missions, so mission-led government. And since the election, I've been working on a project on how we counter far-right populism. I have not got the answers yet, but I've been going round sixth forms all around the country as part of the project, talking to young people about their views of democracy and social media and gender and lots of other things. So that's been absolutely fascinating, and hopefully I can draw on a bit of that in this conversation. My overall argument on education is that there's never been a bigger mismatch between what we teach in schools and what you need to not just survive but thrive in this very complex world. Some of what's done in school is done very well. There'll be sort of non-negotiable elements like the basics of learning how to read and write and be very good at maths are absolutely essential as the foundation for everything. But then there is just too much narrowness in schools. The exam factory means that it's very hard to do anything other in the curriculum. There's no non-examing curriculum anymore, particularly in secondary school. Everything is feeding towards a set of exams. So young people feel they're on a set of hurdles, 16 and 18, and then a degree. And increasingly when they come out, they realize that it's all been slightly weird and not actually what they needed. One fact is really important. 1 in 6, it's almost now 1 in 5 employers don't even look at the qualifications. So that the game everyone's playing is increasingly not even being recognized by employers because they say it's no longer a proxy for anything we're actually looking for, which is problem solving, creativity, collaboration, communication. So we've got to change fundamentally what's done in school. And of course, we've got a juggernaut coming towards us, which is AI. And schools are understandably not even at the foothills of realizing, other than probably deciding to ban it so that people don't cheat, which is, of course, the answer to most things we decide to do with technology in schools. You just ban it. Whereas obviously we've got to be able to harness it. The phrase I use a lot is that schools have, in the future, got to be hard tech and hard human, which is a phrase I got from some American entrepreneur. You've got to come away being brilliant at understanding how to navigate technology, and you've got to be doubling down on the human qualities that allow you to do all the things that technology will never do. And schools are neither good at getting you to be a very good human, nor are they good at getting you to be really good with technology. So we're not preparing people in that way for the world they're going to go into. There are some solutions to this that I can come back to in a minute, but that would be my sort of starting argument.
Wonderful. Peter, thank you for setting that out so clearly and compellingly. Lucy.
So I'm Lucy Heller, and I'm the Chief Executive of ARC, which is an education charity that's been going for just over 20 years. And at the heart of it now, we originally set up as a sort of more general children's charity, but have become over the years focused really on education and largely in this country, although we've done a lot of work internationally. So we have ARC Schools, which is a group of 39 schools across the country, predominantly London, South Coast and Birmingham. We work in areas of high disadvantage, We're trying to make sure that there's great education. But we also, around that, then have built a number of sort of social ventures trying to address some of the problems, not just for our schools, but for the system generally. So we have curriculum programs, now sort of Art Curriculum Plus, which is in around 1,000 schools around the country. We've done teacher training. The Ambition Institute is one of the ARC offshoots that's doing teacher and leadership training, everything from sort of ed tech to children's social work training. And for anyone here thinking of changing career, Now Teach was one of the organizations that we incubated, which is trying to find people who've had successful careers and want to come in later life into teaching, which has been very successful. So there's a range of those things. In terms of the role of education, I think two things. We have sort of the problem set was, what role can education play in both furthering social cohesion and nurturing social capital? It strikes me that we're in danger of asking both too much and too little of schools. And too much, sometimes it's expected that schools can, on their own, particularly in a period of financial austerity, overcome the class system, which, has sort of deep roots. Inequality is deep-rooted. It's quite a lot to ask of schools that they can sort of overcome that single-handed and dissolve the class system. We're also being increasingly asked to substitute for public services. And you'll see, schools during COVID have ended up taking on large of the sort of mental health burdens. CAMS has virtually disappeared. A huge number of services are simply not providing, and schools are stepping in. Equally, we may be that we're asking too little, only in the sense that I think we waste the opportunity that is in schools as sort of community anchors and community hubs. Schools are places where, on the whole, we hope at least, we have strong relationships, not just with our students, but with parents, with the local community. It's completely crazy that we're not operating and that government doesn't incentivize more public sector working across sectors. We were saying, why isn't, for instance, the NHS making use of Dublin? I went into one of our schools in Croydon, which is an area sort of often largely refugee or sort of recent immigrant intake with sort of two women's refugees side by side, very difficult area. A little girl in reception who at age 4 had no teeth, just black stumps because she'd been fed sugar water. The idea that we're not sort of simply getting dental checkups, it's incredibly difficult these days to get dental checkups. Large proportion of our kids have never been to the dentist because it's so hard to get on an NHS list. Why is the NHS not using us to do 60 kids in a day very efficiently? We've approached them. I understand the reasons why they don't, because they're not incentivized to do it. They have their own sort of performance indicators, but that's the kind of thing that we should be looking at. I will only say I was worried before we came in that Peter and I wouldn't find enough to disagree about, but I think in terms of his views on curriculum, I want to do a defense slightly of sort of existing things, and I think that lots of what we talk a lot about, the needs of 21st century education being entirely different from what's gone before. I'm not sure I genuinely believe that. Sure, there have been changes, but some of the fundamentals still exist. And when you think that there are still roughly a third of children in this country who don't get the kind of basic qualifications, we're not talking about hugely academic expectations, but saying basic numeracy and literacy, which need to be assisted. It may be that employers aren't looking at qualifications, but if you look at what happens to those who don't have qualifications, you see that notably they have a much harder time. Of course, there are the exceptions, but part of what schools are about doing is equipping sort of children with those basic skills, and I think some of those have remained much the same and will carry on being so.
Indeed, I said they were non-negotiable. Yeah. So I think we will possibly agree more than you think,
I'm sure we
which
will,
may not make Andy. But no, I said, so numeracy, I mean, the absolute foundations, I don't think anyone in education disagrees with, that you need them as a basic. I would add 2 additional ones as new basics, because I think oracy, which is absolutely vital communication skills, and technology and digital skills. Yep. So I think everyone, 100%, have to come out of school with reading, writing, maths, digital, and oracy. And I don't know whether we would agree on this, the fundamental problem, as anyone here in education will know, is the comparative judgment of exams means a third have to fail every year. So they're not a mastery set of exams. What we would like is 100% of young people to be able to leave school saying they have mastered the basics of literacy and numeracy, but that is impossible within our system. So to be clear, it's not like a music exam, you can 100% could get grade 3 music, or a driving test where if you've met the standard you can drive. You have to fail in order to, a third, in order to the 2/3 to pass. That is an absurd system.
I agree, except Ofqual would say very firmly, no, that's not the case. If it were true that sort of over this cohort, we actually changed it. So if you're saying last year 30% of children didn't deliver the standard, if over time we got to a point where actually at that same standard everybody got through, they say then it would be 100%.
Well, that's not how they market. That's not.
No,
they have to give the certain percentage each year at level 3.
They would say that we'll get too technical, but I agree there's a problem there. But I still think.
But they're not also setting these exams as functional literacy and numeracy. So there's another question about GCSE English, for example, English language. Again, we don't want to get too much in the weeds.
Yeah.
GCSE English language is not actually GCSE English language. It's not a functional literacy test of any kind. So you're not, if you're taking that GCSE, working out whether young people have reached the sort of literacy they need. But where I also agree with you is I think schools are our last hope, if you like. I mean, in terms of what's going on in society, if we don't get schools right as a place where all of these difficult questions can be discussed about the future of democracy, about what's happening online, about all the social media stuff, you know, all the stuff I'm finding in my conversations with these 16 to 18-year-olds. What I'm amazed by, in a way, well, not amazed having been in schools so long, is that there's no space for these in schools. So when I'm going in from outside doing these workshops, there are teachers with their jaws dropping, listening into these conversations because they're never hearing young people talk about these things because they're just being crammed for the A-levels or whatever it is. And I think there's something more important. Because of the onerous nature, which is sort of laudable but is becoming a problem of safeguarding and other things, what the teachers do is close down any comments, particularly from the boys, because they fear they're about to be misogynistic, and we can't have that in our schools, and our duty is to protect the girls. Whereas in my view, you want the girls to be in the conversation, saying it's not acceptable and having an open debate and actually wrestling with these ideas without shutting them down. So there are real problems, and obviously if you're not countering polarization and lots of other things in schools, then they'll just be in their echo chambers online. So schools are our last hope of creating a next generation who can be more tolerant, more accepting of different points of view.
I don't think I quite recognise the schools that you're going to where those conversations aren't being had, but I agree that we do end up, we've sort of pushed too far on the sort of exam factory piece, and some of that's the responsibility of schools, and it's in the same way that Ofsted has become the sort of bogeyman and spent 20 years saying to our sort of principals, you know, Ofsted is a constraint and not a goal. We don't run schools for Ofsted. We run schools for our students, and we need to remember that we know the schools we think, you know, better than Ofsted can coming in for 2 days. But it's still really difficult. Even some of our most experienced heads who've only ever had, you know, outstanding ratings go white at the prospect of Ofsted, and it feels now like to be it's a potentially career-ending experience, 2 days that make the difference. So I think one of the things is saying, no, the profession has to liberate itself partly from this piece and say, that's not what it's about. And I think there are interesting discussions underway that may change some of that. But we do have an over-examined, over-pressurized sort of student life, I think, that we need to think about how we can do better on that. And it's certainly the case that a kind of busy curriculum and exam pressure tends to crowd out things.
Yeah, and if, you know, whenever I've asked teachers or parents or head teachers what they think the purpose of education is, they say it's the maximising of potential. And when I ask them whether they think that's what education does at the moment, they say not at all. So a number of young people who, when you ask them when they leave school, well, was school the place where you found out what you were good at, or found out what you really cared about, or found out all the things that, you know, make you who you are, a sense of identity? Most say no. What the best will say is, but I got my 7 A stars or whatever. I got the right bit of paper. I got the right numbers and letters. And you meet lots of people in their 20s, 30s as well, saying, did school get the most out of you? And it doesn't, and they say they haven't. So that's what's got to change. We've got to have we need to be seeing human beings as three-dimensional, not one-dimensional, and school has got to be looking at the rounded individual, and that gets into all the mental health questions, gets into all the sort of different types of character development in terms of the sort of resilience that you need in life, and it sort of gets into the creativity and the ability to problem solve and think laterally. Something that's dominated by exams, basically schools, you leave your initiative, you park it at the school gates, and when you come into school,
come on, please, you don't think this is true of School 21, the school that you
started?
No,
but I tried
not.
No, I tried not to, but I would still say the constraints on us, so we were seen as a very innovative school, and you've got some very innovative schools. We think on the margins, but most of what we did, particularly as you got to exam years, was to prepare people for exams.
Yeah, but
and it's not even the love of the subject. Even if you were in the silos of we can debate whether you need the sort of single silos of each knowledge. Even within that, you're not becoming a scientist. You are, you know, the thing I love quoting, if you do triple science, biology, physics and chemistry, you're learning 1,000 pages of textbook in 2 years, okay? You can't see the wood for the trees. You're not learning the concepts of science. You're learning science as 1,000 pages of facts. Okay, you don't come out with deep understanding, even within the world of science. So that's got to change.
Yeah, I think you may be asking sort of, there's lots on which we agree. I still think you're caricaturing other schools, saying, yeah, we're all working with, there's still a lot to be done. I mean, part of the business is that not all learning is fun. Lots of learning is grind. To master anything involves some degree of sort of engagement with things that are hard and difficult, and even rote learning is definitely part of that. So I think there's some element that's not all going to be fun, and I think most schools wouldn't recognise. We're imperfect, hugely imperfect, so I agree there's lots of boredom.
But this is the bit I really disagree with, because people rush to the idea that someone like me, because they want a school that's more expansive, wants fun. You know, and then it's a sort of bogeyman fun, which means learning is hard, and then they double down on the defense of very boring schools where students are turned off learning often for good, and they're literally just being talked at the entire time. They're saying, well, that's what learning is. It's very difficult, it's hard, it's whatever.
You're guying my position at least, because I'm not saying that.
I'm not looking for fun in a sort of, you know, frilly way. I'm saying it's got to be engaging. It's got to feel like some of it, not all of it. I believe in scholarship. I mean, I taught medieval history, for God's sake. I believe in scholarship and knowledge for its own sake, but some of school has to be relevant and applied learning to real things in the real world, because that gives you a sense, particularly the students we served in our school, and most of you, or all of your students, having agency in your life matters, showing that what you're learning can be applied to something that makes a difference to people, and learning in that way also really matters. So I don't think it's about fun, but it's about something that is more engaging than the current drilling for exams, which turns people off learning.
Very much enjoying this self-policing conversation, actually. If only sharing were always this easy. Can I tell, we know the audience early on, because I know everyone is going to have strongly held views in education, because everyone has, and everyone should.
Question over there already.
I wasn't going to start that early, actually. 1 second. You'll be first, though. I'll remember you, don't worry. Just to, there may be a difference of degree, but no denying of a mismatch. Maybe from each of you, I could just take one, in addition to what you've said already, concrete suggestion about what should be done differently, whether fundamentally or in degree, to meet the objectives that you've both set out so clearly? Peter, do you want to kick us off?
Well, there's a review going on of curriculum and assessment at the moment, which the interim report was sort of very tame, and it's got to be more radical. I mean, I would do the process in a different way. I was discussing this with Lucy. I think it should be a more expansive process. It should get into real depth. It should be thinking fundamentally about the purpose of education. I think you'd then end up with a very different assessment system, and you'd end up with a broader curriculum that probably narrowed down what you were assessing and gave more flexibility for schools. I believe there should be regional components. You know, if you like, Andy Burnham, a very successful mayor in Manchester, he's got 200 secondary schools. I think he should be in charge of them. And I think some of the curriculum should be nationally mandated. We've agreed on the basics, for example, have to be absolutely done in every single school. But I think someone like Andy Burnham should be able to tailor it, along with lots of other organisations in Manchester and schools, as to what is really needed in that area. So that's one concrete example. And then the other one, I just come back to oracy. I think to learn how you speak in a range of settings in a sophisticated way, which is what we were trying to do with Voice 21. We worked with Cambridge on these 4 strands: physical, cognitive, linguistic, social, emotional, the 4 strands of oracy. They are a really good framework for learning in its own right, but for also how you talk. So I think all that sense of how you find your voice and how you communicate well and articulate your ideas and think more deeply through oracy is absolutely fundamental. I think that should be a far higher priority in schools. So those are 2 things.
Very good. Just on the last of those, again, in the spirit of making this a conversation, disagreement actually, I actually think oracy is nothing like as important as listening well. Speaking well is really easy, because all that really means, I mean, you have to practice and stuff. That's taking stuff in your head and having it come out of your mouth in a broadly coherent way. Enough practice gets you there. But listening's really difficult, because that's about taking what's inside someone else's heads, plural, not singular, and making sense of that. And we're rubbish at listening. And there's no one more rubbish at listening than politicians, actually. They're particularly
no, I totally agree.
So maybe listening should be on the curriculum as well, Peter.
Well, with oracy, and it's obviously often called speaking and listening, to be fair, and with oracy, we do a whole set of things about listening. Let me give you just one, because I think people will find this fun. We've got this thing sometimes with younger students about their 3 M's of listening: macro listening, micro listening, and me listening. Okay? Yeah. And macro listening is looking for the big picture of what someone's saying. So as you're listening to them, you think, well, what's the overall message? Micro listening is looking for the individual examples, but also kind of what's the underlying, you know, are they looking nervous? Are they trying to do this? Or what's the game that's going on? And then me listening is the thing to watch out for, which is the person, obviously in school it happens very often, where you're just thinking about yourself. That I'm about to ask a question, so I'm not listening to the teacher or whatever, because I'm rehearsing the question so as not to be look a fool in the class or whatever. So you're then not listening. Or you're thinking, what am I going to have for lunch? So we all have our own sort of narrative in our head. But if you've got macro, micro, and me, you start to think about listening in a different way.
Likey. Excellent. Lucy?
Well, I think I'm not going to... On curriculum, we agree. I suspect, though, it's a question of time, that I think curriculum change needs really careful national conversation, needs to have some degree of political consensus so it doesn't become simply a sort of switch back and forth. And I think that at the point when the curriculum review was set up, teachers are feeling fairly exhausted with sort of changes, the political battles, COVID, everything else, and there's not really much appetite for sort of radical change right now in the system. We need to take the time to do it. So I would have put it on a sort of slower burn. In the short term, I'm afraid I would say the thing that would make most difference in schools is a bit more money, and certainly, at the very least, a bit more certainty about money. That we're in the ridiculous position of running large institutions where we don't know now in mid-May essentially what our budgets are going to be in September. And the sort of resignation date is coming up for teachers. You can't plan because we don't have those certainties. That's no way to run a railroad. and it should just be different. And we would all want more money, and we accept that it's going to be tough. But even being able to say a 3-year planning cycle seems so obviously sensible to say, do that.
Definitely.
And otherwise, I think actually, in general terms, certainly in terms of policy, a period of calm. I think we do need a bit of the sort of a vision of the sunlit uplands that might be coming, because there isn't much of that at the moment. Teachers feel been through so long periods of being beaten up about not doing this or that, and I'm not sure that we've yet got that sort of vision piece about what we're trying to do.
Fantastic. Your moment has come. better be good now, by the way, after all that build-up.
Is that working? Can you hear me?
We hear you.
So my name's Jenny. I'm a teacher by trade, but now I'm responsible for teacher training at a university in the east of England. So like any good teacher, I kind of broadly agree and disagree with Lucy and Peter in equal measure, particularly about RSA. We've always had speaking and listening. I was trained 20 years ago under the literacy hour, and we were taught how to do speaking and listening. Has it been lost over the last few years? Absolutely. And I think there's something about working with new teachers that are entering the profession, which is so energizing and is like an amazing privilege. But we train thousands of teachers every year, and we lose even more every year. The attrition rate for teachers is astonishing. What are we going to do to try and keep expertise in the profession? Because that's what it's about. Confidence, we've talked about this in the free speech debate, confidence with Ofsted, confidence to talk to children about hate speech, confidence to have those difficult conversations about misogyny. That requires expertise, that requires being in your community, being a valued member of your community, and relationships with families. But we're losing that. We're losing that expertise every year. And I am working really hard to get new teachers into the profession and say to them, this is a job for life. I'd really appreciate the panel's views on that.
Fantastic. Was worth waiting for. Let's take 2 more questions and then we'll go back. Let's go here, front. Choose. Sorry.
Hi, Andy. I have to slightly disagree with you about the listening. The listening is very, very important. We've got 2 ears, 1 mouth, of course. But I have to say, I was in the city, now I'm teaching English as a second language, that I think we do have a crisis in RSA. It's absolutely vital that our young people speak clearly and articulately. They will disadvantage themselves for life if they're not able to do that, and to recognise, as Peter said, the different registers that they might have to operate in, whether it's in a very sophisticated environment or something that is in a slightly different environment. There's also all kinds of dialects, etc., that we have, say, in London, elsewhere. You've got to be able to cope with all of that and still maintain being articulate. So I just really wanted to make that point. I think RSA is absolutely critical.
Very good, thank you. Yes?
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the very insightful session. My name is Sarjina, and I am an entrepreneur and a PhD researcher in entrepreneurship as well. I had a thought, a question that popped up in my head when Peter narrated his interactions with an American entrepreneur. And you said that there was a takeaway that said, go hard on tech and also go hard on people. I think that's incredibly intriguing, because on the surface one might perceive it to be quite a paradoxical parallel in a way, because when you go hard on tech, in a way you take away from people, and when you go more people, usually it's less tech. So I was wondering, in a pedagogical or a learning environment, how do you strike a balance between the two if you consider them to be contradictory at all?
Fantastic. 3 fantastic observations. Peter, I think first on that last one. Or any of them.
Let's go on the last one. Tech has had a terrible history in schools. Interactive whiteboards, I think, were one of the great disasters of schools when they all came in. And it ended up being death by PowerPoint. And literally, I mean, to this day, there are teachers who are still just doing everything through the PowerPoint. Then everyone had a laptop or an iPad and all the rest of it, and that was sort of flavour of the month. But most people hadn't charged them, or the teachers hadn't been trained, so they actually delayed the lesson. I remember early days as a teacher finding it a complete nightmare. Now everyone wants to ban phones because they're sort of corrupting children. AI, people just think, as I said earlier, it's just sort of cheating. So we're not good at schools at, and IT, the IT GCSE and things along the way has been a basket case. It's been either doing a bit of a spreadsheet, you know, learning how to do Excel, or then everyone had to be a coder. Well, not everyone does have to be a coder, and obviously AI is now doing all the coding. So the whole technology thing in schools has basically been a disaster. I think we've got to sort of step back and do it properly, but the main thing is you've got to just be agile. Young people are going to be in a world where they're just going to, you know, AI's got to be used as a co-pilot, but in an intelligent way of sort of how you work with it, what it's good at, what it isn't good at, what you have to sense check. And I think it's that. Some people now call it sort of media literacy or technology literacy. I think we've got to get good at that. And I think at the same time, we've got to double down on the sort of on what it is to be human, and what we will always, you know, there's a lot of good writing at the moment about what is the stuff that AI will never do in the way that, you know, it's hard to predict totally, but there's some obvious things that we need to do more of in school than we're doing at the moment in terms of problem solving and lateral thinking and creativity and judgment, words like discernment, which are really important, which gets to the depth of the human experience. And I think then there are tensions between the two, but you can see them both separately first and then brought together.
Lucy.
Well, I want to come back on the sort of teacher attrition, because I agree, obviously, and in the sense that the missing piece from what I said earlier was that what we need is more great teachers, and we're seeing too many good people leave the profession. Some of that, I think money is actually sort of secondary, probably, because I think most teachers do it because they love it. Sometimes they get sort of driven out by pay, but it's much more about the sort of twin things of one, wanting a degree of professional autonomy. And I think that, you know, what we're talking about in terms of an exam culture means too often that teachers can feel that they're both being force-fed themselves and force-feeding it down to their students, and the sort of toughness of exam pressures. And I hope in our schools that we get the balance right of providing the support so that they're getting what they need. So great training, sort of great support, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel in every lesson, but also that sort of professional freedom and that real sense of sort of doing something with professional qualities. The other piece is about flexible working, and I'm hugely conscious that in almost every other profession now, there is a degree of flexibility, and we hear continually from young teachers that they're moving just because they want to get out of it. It is really tough. There are very few other places where you get the degree of rigidity. We have kids in school from, you know, kind of 8:30 to 4. It's hard. There's an expectation. Schools are being asked to deliver something, and I don't see particularly an immediate way around that. But we have to think about how we can work more flexibly. There's a difficulty, and it's something that I don't think actually tech has yet delivered, and we were trying to say the department to major on this, that if somebody could get sort of timetabling to be more flexible than currently it is, anyone from schools will recognize the business that is still kind of 2 weeks, sort of where somebody sits with a hot towel over their head and tries to work out the timetable for the year ahead, and it's very difficult to change. We need that to be more flexible, but those are the things that I think would make a difference. But it's not easy, and it's particularly not easy now when the pressures are, you know, you'll have seen lots of schools going through restructuring at the moment because of the sort of funding gap in terms of next year.
Fantastic. I'll take 3 questions from the left wing to avoid political bias accusations. We'll start at the front here and then...
Thank you so much. I'm Elsa Kent. I work in nature, food and farming education, and I've been absolutely fizzing in this conversation because it's brilliant, and I agree and disagree with a lot of what you said, but fundamentally, when we're talking about the purpose of education, I feel just amazed that there's been no acknowledgement of the fact that our planet faces the most, you know, uncertain future. And when we're talking about the role of education, how have you not mentioned the fact that we need to be equipping students to know how to live on a living earth, how to care for that living planet that we all share? I feel very emotional even bringing this up. We need to be talking about this. That's a fundamental, you know, when we talk about literacy, numeracy, oracy, we are human beings on a living earth. How is that not part of those core elements?
Excellent challenge. Let's just pass this maybe back there, and then we'll come here.
Thank you. I don't quite know how to follow that one, but I've taught in 3 countries, and I've worked with teachers, head teachers, I've worked with people in university, right across the whole kindergarten, very important. And it seems to me that most of the time you're talking about secondary education and exams. Now, where you kill a child's confidence and their love of learning is in the primary school, or maybe even in kindergarten.
Right.
And for my sins, back in '86, we devised a national curriculum. We worked on the literacy hour, which I'm furious about. And the very first article I wrote in this country was called Finding a Voice. And there is nothing like the moment when you work with an individual and suddenly there's a look on their face, their eyes light up, and you know you've recognized. And I've interviewed people who've said, there was this teacher, and I was seen. So there needs to be more teachers, more respect, and more time to connect with individuals at early ages, because that's when the damage is done.
Fantastic. We go here. And then, yeah.
Hi. Neurodiversity, surprised that's not been mentioned yet. I'm an ex-teacher, I'm a school reader, I'm a psychotherapist. Some of our brightest people are neurodiverse, and that's a huge burden for schools to have to cope with for teachers. So what are your views on that?
Fantastic. And if you can both be as terse as possible, try and fit in 3 more questions after this. Peter.
I agree on the planet, and one of the ways of doing this is a lot of these issues don't fit into the silos of our subjects that still dominate everything. So I think there are 1 or 2 schools at the moment piloting interdisciplinary learning, which is obviously how the real world works and how universities are doing far more courses that are that way. So to have a climate one, there's one, St Paul's famous public school, for example, is doing this at the moment. There's a proper course with applied learning as well as sort of knowledge-based learning with it. So I'm totally agreeing with you, but I think it is an example of interdisciplinary learning that we need more of. Early years, I totally agree. I think the early years curriculum is actually a better curriculum because it's more holistic. So all of the things you're learning in reception then get watered down as you go up the school. So I totally agree with you. You've got to get the early years right, and primary is a crucial time. Some people say it's between about the ages of 6 to 12 where you really find out what your passions are if you're directed in the right way. And those, I think, are still crucial ages. And then neurodiversity is another reason why we've got 2 one-dimensional system. Because a lot of neurodiverse young people are put off learning altogether because they're not people who like just being sat in a desk, talked at all day by teachers in a very linear way. So I think, again, a broader, more diverse diet in schools, it would really help with that.
Lucy.
So quickly, sort of yes on that, yes on sort of climate and the earth as your home. The only problem across all these things, as the curriculum review is discovering, is that any time you start talking about curriculum, there's an endless list of what people want schools to cover, and there's only limited time. I completely agree on primary. It's been sort of a great sort of strength at ARC because we have sort of not just primaries, we have also ARC Start. And one of the problems is that I think successive waves of early years policy has been really focused on childcare for working parents rather than child development, and we're trying to address that. I think we have our primary schools and our nurseries are lovely spaces that we hope do exactly what you're talking about. What I want to see more of, and I think key stage 3 for me, is the great sort of education waiting room at the moment, that it feels like a sort of preparation, and you hear both teachers and students talk of it almost as sort of, I'm working towards this with my GCSEs, and that should be an extension, exactly the point about, 6 to 12. I think it's sort of slightly later. The first years of secondary school should be that real opening up of the world, and we're not using the freedoms that we have, I think, to think interestingly about that. On the neurodiversity, I think this is part of the wider thing about the explosion in kind of special stroke additional needs, and there's lots of discussion obviously going on at that moment. We're now in an impossible position, and I think the 2014 Act kind of is partly responsible. An entirely well-meant policy decision has ended up with this explosion, and a kind of atomization, so that parents who in my days at school would have fought like tigers to avoid a SEND designation for their child, now see it as part of doing their best by children. We've got an adversarial situation in which, you know, you have to go to battle, huge amount is being spent on just getting to a diagnosis without being able to offer decent medicine. We've got to completely reverse that, but that's going to be a really difficult thing to do, and it needs both political will and some money, and whether that will come, you know, is going to be...
Remains to be seen. 2 more questions, if they're super sharp as well. And I promised this gentleman, well, I didn't promise you, I just looked at you actually, and let's go, so I can't not do it now. So we'll go here, and who wants to last? Look at this.
Oh, go on.
Choices, what?
Just let them run over.
Yeah, we'll do that. Right. So.
Okay, my name is Armstrong. So critical thinking, often mentioned, and compassion. But my question is, how on earth do you instill those skills into education when you've got so much disruption, critical thinking, so much polarization in terms of compassion, and so much speed of change with technology? How on earth do you approach it in that very big context?
Right. Pass that mic. I'm going to do 3 questions. Lucy's persuaded me. This lady here, I think, had a hand up. Here? I hope so.
My name is Leonie McClay, co-founder of a community interest company called Zingera, all about blending real-world and virtual learning. Partly inspired by my 18-year-old's journey in and out of school and back into school. He was out of school between the ages of 9 and 16. Had 3 months in a special school after first 5 years in regular primary school. His blended learning journey has been transformative, and he's made the very difficult decision yesterday to choose between Cambridge and Imperial College in his application, and it just shows the power of combining technology with real-world learning.
Fantastic, thank you. Congratulations. And last question here.
Okay, I'll try to make it a fun one. On the theme of connected societies, as societies are evolving and becoming more diverse, and the face of the classroom is changing, and we're having more and more students who potentially have a very different lived experiences from their teachers. They're more interconnected with the global world because of the internet and social media, and have more diverse lived experiences and perspectives. How are we equipping our teachers to handle classrooms like that? With students maybe they are less relating with in communities that they may not be a part of? What kind of training are we doing? What tools are we giving teachers to better handle those diverse spaces? And then to some of the points that people were saying earlier, enable those conversations that they have with all the different perspectives that they bring.
3 fantastic observations. I'm going to pass it back, and I'll start with Lucy this time. And Lucy and Peter, answer those 3 questions.
Very swiftly, you're going to tell
Very
me.
swiftly, and with lashings of optimism.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I am an optimist by nature. So I think on critical thinking and compassion, I think it's entirely possible in different ways. So I think critical thinking can definitely be taught, and that's something that sort of runs through the curriculum and how you approach learning. I think compassion is modeled rather than taught. And I think this is about the culture and ethos that schools provide, and you're showing how those things run through. I think congratulations on that. Very nice to have those choices, and I agree, we've got to think about but schools should be trying to do more. I think the answer will be we need to have that mainstream schools need to deal with most students, and we need to get back to a much more collective view of that. On the connected and less related, again, I'm not sure I really sort of see that. I think that if I look at, ARC, we train about 250 teachers a year, not just for our network of schools, but for others. And they're a pretty diverse group, and we've gone out of our way to make sure of that. We hope, certainly not true in all cases, that teachers come from the local community or of the local community, and there's a mix. And I don't think there needs to be that identity necessarily between the two. You want to have a mix. And some of what school is about is opening up the world to new things and other things. So it's not a kind of direct identity. I think that teacher training is, and the training that we do, is precisely, I hope, about equipping our teachers to have the tools to be able to have the conversation with anyone, the focus on the individual that's in front of them, and whatever their experience is. Don't pretend it's perfect, but I think we are doing that pretty well.
Lucy, thank you. Peter.
Because we've doubled down on the knowledge-rich curriculum and then didactic teaching, I think, so the answer to all three of these is what we've lost, I think, is the repertoire of teaching. And it answers some of the previous questions as well about what keeps someone in the profession is thinking this is an intellectual, layered, I mean, when I first came in, that's what I thought, sort of complex, it would take you many years to master all these different techniques. So in terms of critical thinking or compassion, I agree with Lucy, critical thinking could be woven into every subject, but there's a set of techniques there. Compassion is both modeled, but there are also techniques, RSA techniques, if you like philosophy for children, which has a good evidence base behind, and a number of people in the room will know about it, where you sit in circles and there are protocols, and then you wrestle with moral dilemmas. Similarly, on the social media and understanding, that's got to be rich discussions that are facilitated in the class to really get underneath what people are thinking and what people are doing online and all the rest of it. And similarly, your real world and virtual blending is a type of repertoire for teachers. It's a sophistication in understanding how you can use technology. And I'm very much an advocate in real world learning and giving young people the chance to apply their knowledge to situations outside of school because it's so empowering. So I think that's what we've got to be promoting.
We should draw things to a close as we're in overtime. Listen, this is a conversation that is sure we'll want to continue. But what an amazing conversation we've had in the room today, full of solutions and full of optimism. And for that, please join me in thanking Peter and thanking Lucy. Absolutely brilliant. Listen, don't leave yet. Although we have now done, the day is done. It's been an absolutely wonderful day. I think I imagine some of you as well, as the lights dim, have run through the full gamut of emotions today, actually. So frowning at some of the injustices, laughing at some of the gags. I felt quite emotional when Hilary was speaking, actually about her stories. And of course, the whole day has been full of joy. So thank you everyone for making that the case. Let me extend three very quick thank yous. Three quick but important thank yous. The first to all the speakers and the hosts and the workshop leads and the artists and the performers who, without exception, have been exceptional. So a round of applause to all of them. Secondly, to RSA staff and indeed to the Company of Cooks team who provided the food and the drink, who again have excelled themselves in making today so special. It's invidious to pick out any one individual, so I'm going to do exactly that. And that individual is Mary Ryan, actually. Mary, this is like you. This is your final Fellows Festival, and you've been such a enormous part of all the events the RSA has had over so many years. So, Mary, stand up and. And finally, last but by no means least, of course, to all of you in the room, in the house, and online. It goes without saying, but I will say it for one last time. This is my final Fellows Festival, of course. You are the beating heart of the RSA. You always have been, you always will be, and nothing demonstrates that better than events like today. Thank you for making it so. Thank you for making it joyful, and all power to your elbow in the future. Very final point. The bar is still open. It will remain open for a few hours yet. So please join me there, where I hope all of you will come along and buy me a drink. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.